I keep getting cut off. Here we go. Chapter 1 was mostly Oak's family history. It also explained how Captain Oakes had made a lot of money shipping goods between America and England. When the War of Independence began, he gave command to his ships to the new American Navy. There was that great painting of Captain Oakes in full uniform on the deck of a ship, the one that was hanging on the third-floor hallway of the school. Another painting showed a British warship firing at the town of Edgeport. The front of the Oakes building had been hit by 3 cannonballs, but the walls were so thick that the place had barely been damaged. After the war, and after he had been thanked by Congress and President George Washington himself, Captain Oakes got the idea of turning his huge warehouse into a school, a permanent contribution to the life of the town and the nation. Ben skipped around a lot in the book, mostly skimming, but the chapter he really got into was the one about the construction work. The whole inside of the warehouse building had been ripped out and then rebuilt to make classrooms, hallways, and offices. And in the center of the book, there was a page that unfolded twice into a huge sheet. It was covered with copies of the original drawings and plans for the school remodeling job. The person who had drawn up the plans and then supervised the school construction was a ship's carpenter named John Vining. The name seemed familiar to Ben, but he didn't stop to think about it. Too much to look at. The man was a good artist, and Ben especially loved the small drawings around the edges of the plan. There were sketches showing how each fireplace should look, how the granite blocks for the front steps should be stacked, even drawings of the new doorknobs and hinges. One drawing showed how the staircase landings would look and how the handrails would be shaped. And on paper, Ben noticed something he had never seen while hurrying up and down the actual staircases of the school each day. The balusters and handrails looked like they belonged on an old sailing ship, which made sense, of course. John Vining worked mostly on ships, not buildings. Ben's eye was drawn to the lower left corner of the large sheet. There was an especially clear drawing, and below it a carefully written note from the carpenter. Oak railing staircase looking down from the upper deck. Ben almost jumped out of his chair, almost shouted, "The word's on the coin!" Of course, the captain and his carpenter were sailors. They wouldn't have talked about the first, second, or third floor. They would have said lower, middle, or upper deck. If attacked, look north-northeast from amidships on the upper deck. The reference area was tucked away from the librarian's desk, so Ben got out his phone and lit up the camera. He zoomed in on the left corner of the large sheet. He let the camera focus and snapped an image. Then he sent the picture in a text to Jill. Here's what the book looked like. The drawings of the school. And the different parts of it. Here's the little note he was talking about by the stairs. He carefully refolded the large page, closed the book, stood up, and slipped it back into its place on the shelf. Then he walked around the end of the tall bookcase, and his heart nearly stopped. It was Lyman. He was washing one of the large windows that surrounded the library workroom, a spray bottle in one hand and a rag in the other. Ben looked away quickly, his head spinning. Did Lyman have his class schedule and that book? Did he see Ben take a picture? Maybe he knew all about the coin, knew it was in his pocket right this minute. Ben made himself walk casually back to where Robert was slaving away. He made himself sit and open his notebook to his report, made himself put his pen on the paper and write some words, one after another. He even made himself breathe slowly. He looked calm, but inside he was churning. He couldn't wait to get to math class next period. He'd be able to tell Jill about the book and explain that picture he'd sent, unless Lyman followed him. and another reason he couldn't wait to get to math class. It was up on the 3rd floor, the upper deck. Chapter 10, Rose on the Floor. Ben didn't believe in ghosts. At least he didn't think he did. But as he burst out of the library and headed for the south staircase, it felt like something was directing him, making him see things, making him think things. It was just his imagination. Probably. He passed the framed parchment map of Edgeport on the wall outside the office, just as he had 1,000 times before. Except this time, he saw the town where Captain Oaks had grown up, lived a long life, and then died. As he waited with a bunch of other kids near the stairs, he imagined himself surrounded by boys in knee breeches and homespun shirts, and girls wearing long plain dresses. He heard their feet on the floorboards, heavy hobnail boots and square-toed shoes with buckles. He imagined horses snorting at the hitching posts out back, and wooden ships creaking against the seawall out front. And as he went up the stairs, every landing looked like the afterdeck of a frigate, which is a boat. He noticed the curved oak posts rising up along the side walls to support the floor joists, noticed how the floor planks were as thick as the deck of a ship, resting on chestnut beams that could have survived a direct hit from a cannonball, which they actually did. It was the sort of woodwork built to endure the ice storms and winds of the North Atlantic, and more than 200 years later, after weathering the bumps and pulls and thumps of tens of thousands of kids, none of the railings wobbled, none of the floors creaked or sagged. This place had been built for rough weather, and it was still ship-shape. When Ben got to the 3rd floor, he spotted Jill near the math room. He did a quick scan for the janitor. All clear. So he walked over. "I got the picture you sent," she said. "It's too small. What is it?" Ben quickly explained what he'd discovered, expecting her to be impressed. With her head tilted to one side, she said, "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." Ben pointed at the railing around the staircase. "That's it, right there. The woodwork from the drawing I sent. And the carpenter's note said it was on the upper deck." "Okay, so if this is the upper deck, then how do you find amidships?" Ben pulled out a sketch he had made during his last few minutes in the library. "Here's the shoreline to the east, and this is the original school building, which is basically a rectangle. And anywhere along this east-west line through the center of the building would be amidships. Plus, anywhere along this north-south center line could also be called amidships. But true amidships would be right where those two lines cross." There's a picture. So amidships is right where the middle of the lines touch. So right there. And if we find that spot, then we use a compass and strike a line north-northeast and see what we find. "I think there's one over there on the floor." "What? What are you talking about?" "A compass," Jill said. "Just outside the girls' room, there's a round thingy on the floor with an arrow and a capital N, so that's a compass, right?" That's what she's talking about. "Be right back." Ben rushed straight for the girls' room, but about 6 feet away he stopped. 4 girls were standing there, and they quit talking and stared at him. He didn't dare get closer. But he went to the wall opposite the doorway and looked north along the hall, then south toward the staircase where he'd left Jill, and he was pretty sure he was standing amidships. He hurried back to Jill, who had clearly enjoyed his embarrassment at the girls' room door. He ignored her grin. "So, when you say this compass is on the floor, what do you mean?" Jill got serious again. "It's not really on the floor, it's more like it's in the floor, right in the wood. A metal circle about as big as a necklace, and the arrow sticking through it, and That's a compass rose, and the carpenter must have put it there as a clue, a marker. And now we just have to. The school bell rang, the first of 3 clangs, and the kids still in the hall scrambled for their classrooms. Ben and Jill spent the next 54 minutes on opposite sides of the math lab. It was a review day for the big state test, so there were nonstop drills and timed problems. Ben spent a lot of time hunching down over his workbook or staring at the explanations on the chalkboard, and he asked Mrs. Burmeister at least 10 questions. Math wasn't his best subject. But when class ended, Jill hurried up to Ben out in the hall and handed him a piece of paper. It looks sort of like this, the compass rose. He barely glanced at it. Good. Come on, we've got to go talk to Mrs. Hinman. Now? How come? Ben was already headed for their social studies classroom. You'll see. Just nod and smile till you catch on. The teacher was gathering her things to go to lunch, and Ben smiled when she looked up at him. Hi, Mrs. Hinman. I know this is a bad time to talk, but this will only take a second. If Jill and I wanted to do a special project about the history of Oaks School, would you help us out? Because we'd need permission to be in the building before classes, and probably after school too, for research. Jill nodded and smiled. He went on, and we'll have to work on it at least a couple of weeks. Jill smiled again and nodded. Mrs. Hinman pursed her lips and eyed the 2 students suspiciously. You want to start a special project this close to the end of the year? Jill nodded, then quickly said, Really, it was my idea because my social studies grade isn't so great. So if we could get some extra credit points, that would be great. Like maybe if we gave a report to the class before the end of school? From right behind them, a voice said, Yeah, a report for extra credit. Jill and Ben jerked their heads to look, and it was Robert Garrett, a serious look on his face. All business. Turning quickly back to the teacher, Ben said, Actually, Jill and I wanted to work on this by ourselves, and No fair, said Robert, shaking his head. If it's an extra credit project, I should be able to work on it too, right? And I want to do my own part so I get a separate grade. Yeah, maybe I could make my part of the report like a documentary movie or something, so I'll get graded for my own work. Mrs. Hinman was already motioning them toward the door. This all sounds fine, and Robert's right. Besides, it's probably a bigger project than you and Jill think, so there'll be plenty for everyone to do. I'll help you get started, and I'll also ask Mrs. Sinclair if you can use the library before and after school. She's in early, and there's always someone there after school. Ben didn't want to seem upset about Robert, so he said, That'll be great, but could we have a meeting about it today? Because we really want to get started, like maybe after lunch? The teacher shook her head. Not today. I've got playground duty. I'll mention it to Mrs. Sinclair after school, and then we can all talk again on Monday. Now off you go. And she herded them into the hall, pulled her door shut, and then slipped past and hurried down the south stairwell. Robert said, This is great, huh? Sorry to butt in and everything, but I really need the extra points for my grade. Ben nodded and tried to smile. Right, for his grade. He probably wanted to get an A++ in social studies instead of just an A+. This guy was a royal pain. Plus, he was already stuck with Robert on that Jack London report. The idea of having to work with him on something else was almost more than Ben could bear. So, talk to you losers later, okay? I've got to catch up with Mrs. Hinman and ask her a question. And he dashed away down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Ben glared at Jill. You had to get all clever and ask for extra credit. Now we've got to deal with him. And he jerked his thumb toward the stairwell. Jill didn't blink. Mrs. Hinman thought you were nuts, and she was right. Nobody just walks up to a teacher and asks for some extra schoolwork. So my cleverness Just save your half-baked idea. And don't worry about Robert. He could even be useful as a distraction. Ben knew Jill was right about everything, but he gave her a disgusted look anyway and headed for the stairs. "Where are you going?" she said. "Duh, lunch." "Not me." Jill looked around, then turned and started walking north. "I'm going to the girls' room, amidships." She glanced back at Ben with a smile. "Coming?" That is the end of chapter 10. So we will start chapter 11 next time.